make yourself aware that you do have a worldview, and that as a Muslim in the modern world, your worldview is a mixture of Islam and things that are very much, opposite to Islam, or coming from a different starting position. All of us are juggling this together. So we need to learn to recognize that. We need to clean our worldview.
That the big problem with the Muslims is Muslims not realizing that they have been fed with modern assumptions, and they have to unlearn them to see Islam for what it is.
Like, hatu burhanakum in kuntum sadiqin, bring your proof if indeed you are truthful, right? So we are ready to have discussions about this. We don't just believe because our forefathers believed. Like, we are ready to say the Quran is, revelation, and here's why.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to Incisive Thoughts, and today we have another special guest for you guys. Today's guest gonna be very special. Today we have Dr. Sharif El-Tobgui, who is actually an associate professor of Arabic and Islamic studies at Brandeis University, where he has taught courses on Islamic law, theology, ethics, Arabic, both classical and modern, and Islam and the West. He also serves as affiliated adjunct associate professor at the Boston Islamic Seminary, where he teaches courses on Islamic theology and intellectual foundations of modern world. Formerly, he taught at Harvard University for 5 years at preceptor in Arabic. Dr. Sharif is particularly interested in questions concerning the relationship between reason and revelation in Islamic tradition, and has published on manifestations of his tension in Islamic legal theory, Quranic exegesis, and theology. He also has a keen interest in questions pertaining to Islam and modernity and the challenges posed by contemporary issues, be they intellectual, spiritual, or social. Recently, he has released a 33-hour free course with Sapiens Institute called Islam and Lgbt, Gender, Sex, Morality in the Modern Age. So we are delighted to have such a renowned guest on our platform. Let's call him on stage. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. How are you?
Alhamdulillah, I'm doing good, Ustad. How are you doing?
Very well, alhamdulillah. Thank you.
Thank you for giving us this opportunity.
It's my honor and my pleasure, alhamdulillah.
So I think I missed mentioning what we are going to speak about today. And what I want, our audience to learn from you is this aspect of modernity, the dark side of modernity, something along those lines. So I will start with something, because maybe many of the people might not be familiar with your work. I want to ask you something about a worldview. What is a worldview, and does everyone have a worldview?
Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulillah, ashraf al-anbiya wal mursalin, wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man tabi'ahum bi ihsanin ila yawm ad-din. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. To you and to all of the audience, it's a great pleasure to be with you today on this Mubarak day of Jum'ah, alhamdulillah. Welcome to all of my brothers and sisters in India and the entire subcontinent and beyond, the entire world, inshallah. May Allah unify this ummah and make us a strong ummah, ummatan wasata, that people can be guided by, inshallah, as has been the case for so many centuries. So your question about a worldview is basically, the way I always explain it is, when you open your eyes and you look out onto the world, you're actually perceiving it through a particular filter. Everybody has certain assumptions about the world that they are usually not very aware of, because these are things that we acquire when we're very young. It's kind of like our native language. If you grow up in a place, you just acquire the language that you hear spoken around you, and it's very natural, it's very innate and intuitive, and you don't know how it happens. And especially if you grow up in a monolingual environment, not like India, but like the United States, most people are just monolingual in English, then you open your mouth and American English comes out of your mouth, and you can't really even imagine how you could speak or describe the world in a different way. And if somebody asks you about the structure of your native language, it's often very difficult to tell them, because you can't really reflect on it, because it's so innate to you that you don't really have any rational grasp on it. So sometimes a foreigner will come and say, "Oh, do you say this in English?" And you'll say, "No, no, no, that's wrong." And they'll say, "Why?" And you'll say, "I don't know, it's just wrong. It just sounds wrong." And native speakers often are very bad at teaching their own language because they don't really have a kind of conscious conception of its structure. It's just native and intuitive to them. And so similarly, just like everybody has a language, every human being has at least one, if not several, native languages, everybody also has a worldview. And so our worldview, in a sense, is like the language of thought. So when you consider the world, right, and I don't mean consider it philosophically, but when you just think about the world and about yourself and about things around you, everybody has some set of assumptions about, what kinds of things are real, for example. I could hold up this telephone and everyone agrees that the phone exists because we can see it. So we all agree that things that we can see exist. But what about things that we can't see? Is there such thing as like a ghaib, what we would call in Arabic a ghaib, like an unseen realm or metaphysical realm? Is there or not? As Muslims, of course, we would affirm, yes, there are angels, there are jinn. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we don't see him in this world, so he's in the ghaib with respect to us. Many people in the modern world, it's based on a materialistic, like scientific materialistic paradigm. And the existence of an unseen realm, for many people, is just a priori excluded, right? They just deny it. If you can't see it, then it's not real, or you can't affirm that it's real because the only way you could know is through basically reason or empirical science. So everyone has some sort of conception. And then, so what kinds of things?
So like if someone says that I don't have a worldview, you might have a worldview, I don't have a worldview, what would be the response?
That's not possible. Yeah, you could be unaware of your worldview, right? But you can't not have one because everybody has some kind of assumptions, And like, what is knowledge? When you say we know that this is the case, what does it mean to know? What are the sources of knowledge? What is a human being, for example? People talk about human origins and evolution and things like that, and they act as if it's obvious what we're talking about when we say human being. What is a human? Are we human just by virtue of our physical form? Are there other aspects to our being that are, intrinsic to us as human beings? And are they the types of things that are even in principle reducible to a kind of scientific explanation or not? Like, all of these are assumptions. And then you have assumptions about morals and ethics. What is right? What is wrong? Where do we derive knowledge of what is right and wrong? Is it just social convention? Do we derive it from reason? Is it from, revelation? Like, as Muslims, we would obviously, put revelation like first and foremost. All of these things like come together to form your worldview. Like, what is a proper relationship between people? What is a proper relationship between parents and children, husbands and wives? Also, you could bring economic factors. I don't do this as explicitly in my talks, but definitely it's something that could be added. What is the nature of wealth? What is the nature of money? What does it mean to own something? What are the proper ways of earning and disposing of wealth, right? Societies, and both contemporary societies and historically, if we compare, different societies in the past to today, they deal with these questions in many different ways, right? So if you take all of these things together, that's not necessarily an exclusive list, but I think it's pretty comprehensive. If you take all of those factors together and find out what somebody believes to be the case or how they perceive the world on all of those different levels, that's pretty much their worldview. And it affects how they see the world. It affects how they experience the world. It affects how they interact with the world, right? And so everybody, whether you live in India today, in the year 1445, or you live, in Persia in the 9th century, or you live in the Amazon rainforest or ancient Egypt, everybody has, just like everyone has some type of language, right, which can differ from time to place, everybody has, a worldview. You can't not have a worldview, even if you're not aware of it. Like, you have some prism through which you are interpreting the world. Yeah.
So basically, if we summarize, you're saying the components of a worldview would be what, your beliefs about what exists, your beliefs about how do you know what exists, your belief about knowledge, then your beliefs about the human nature, then your belief, your aspect, your understanding about morality, or what principles of morality do you follow, then what aesthetic principles do you follow, or you incline towards. These are the things, and many other things, as you mentioned, they all come under one worldview.
Exactly.
A person's worldview.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when it comes to the worldview, is the worldview just like something that is fully consciously believed by someone, or is it like a combination of subconscious and conscious, or is it fully subconscious in terms of like, if a person's worldview is formed all by his conscious beliefs, or is it a combination of both?
Yeah, that's a very good question. A good way to put it. I think, when you put it that, it's basically a combination of conscious and subconscious. I think, again, just like your native language, when you're 3 years old, it's completely subconscious, right? You just speak and you don't have any rational understanding of language or language structure and all of that. You just speak. But as you grow older, and especially you go to school and you learn things like grammar, you say, oh, okay, there's a noun, there's a verb, there's an adjective. You start learning to analyze language rationally and consciously, and then you can start seeing the structure of your own language more. And then if you learn another language, it's even more clear, because then you start seeing how languages can differ. So I think with the worldview, it's very similar. It's largely implicit, it's largely subconscious, but certain aspects of it are conscious, especially the aspects that people talk about, the aspects that are like foremost in people's minds, that are talked about in the culture a lot. But there are many, many aspects of it that are just very deep below the surface and kind of just implicitly conceded by everybody within the society. And they're so obvious to people and so universal and so, omnipresent, that you almost can't even see them, because it's like a fish in water. You can't see the water, right? We can't see the air we breathe, but we would die without it, right? Like we're breathing it through our entire bodies all day, but we can't see it. So I think certain basic assumptions are so basic that people like wouldn't even think that, oh, that's just an assumption. Like I thought that's just the way like it was, right? Like I didn't think that this could be questioned. But then when you compare your worldview, or you run into a different worldview, either you study like a historical society or philosophy of the past, or you come into contact with a person or a culture or a society today in a different part of the world that has like a very different way of looking at things and different way of going about things, then you can say, oh my gosh, something I never even thought about before. I thought it was just natural. I see that these people have a very different view, and they don't take for granted what I always thought was just unquestionable, right? So yes, it's a combination of subconscious and conscious and subconscious. The more you are, kind of go to school, certain aspects of it are stressed within the educational system, so they become more conscious. But other aspects are reinforced by the educational system, but they're not really presented as like, explicit commitments or something like that. And so they continue to just be experienced as just quote unquote the way it is, right? And then, like I said, if you come into contact with more than one worldview, right, then you can start seeing aspects of your own original worldview more clearly, because they conflict with a different worldview. And then you have to start thinking through, oh, well, it's possible to see this particular aspect in a different way. It's possible to have a different view on, X factor, whatever it is, or to do things a different way. So.
So I think that has some very important stuff that I learned from this, is that, where a person is born, which school does he go to, what his parents teach him, and his upbringing, his environment has a huge effect on how he sees the world, how he thinks what exists in the world and what does not exist in the world. So I think this is where I think we can jump to one very important topic, which is what is the modern worldview, and does Islam as a system, does Islam itself have its own worldview, or it does not? What is your view on that?
Yeah, so I mean, Islam is a affirmation. At the end of the day, it's an affirmation about truth and about reality, right? When we say La ilaha illallah Muhammadun Rasulullah, this has many, many implications, right? When you say La ilaha illallah, there's no God except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you're basically you're making a declaration about a fundamental declaration about the nature of reality. You're saying that there is a God, that he is the truth, that he is the ultimate, that everything else is sort of derived from and created by him. So this sets up like a very particular ontology and way of looking at, existence, right? And when you say Muhammadun Rasulullah, this also has many implications, because what does it mean if the Prophet ﷺ is truly a prophet? It means that what he brought, which is the Quran, is the word of God, the creator, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so everything within the Quran is true. And therefore, this gives us a very particular picture of reality. What kinds of things exist? We talked about before, as Muslims, we affirm, for example, the existence of a ghaib. There's alam al-ghaib wa shahada, there's the realm of the unseen and the seen. How do we know about that? We know about it through revelation, right? I've never seen an angel before. I've never heard one. I've never spoken to one, but I would absolutely affirm that yes, angels exist, and I know that for sure. How do I know that for sure? Because we have a reliable source of knowledge about that. What is that source of knowledge? Revelation, right? The Quran. Well, why do you hold that the Quran is revelation? That's a different discussion. But if you do, that has a lot of implications, right? We also know a lot about who we are as human beings, where we come from, what our purpose is in the world, where we're going. It also provides us with a very specific, moral and ethical structure, right? Which comes to us in the form of the divine command. We have things that are halal, things that are haram, things that we're supposed to do, not supposed to do. The Prophet, peace be upon him, also said, إِنَّمَا بُعِثْتُ لِأُتَمِّمَ مَكَارِمَ الْأَخْلَاقِ. I was only sent to perfect the noble virtues, right, and noble traits of character. So there's a whole ethical program of reforming one's character, and so on and so forth, and many other things. Of course, we talked about wealth and money. How do you buy and sell and gain wealth and dispense of wealth? Of course, Islam is very intimately concerned with this as well, right? We have morals and rules about what is halal and what is haram in terms of gaining money, in terms of spending money. And so all of this comes together to form, a comprehensive worldview. It's not just like background music or something you do like when you get married, or maybe you go to Jum'ah and just, kind of like hang out at the masjid for half an hour and then you go about your life. Like ideally, Islam is actually providing an entire worldview. It's a complete integrated lens through which Muslims, to the extent that they're permeated by Islam, right, it will affect everything, everything that they see about the world. It will affect the way we interact with the world, the way we experience the world, right? So it's very consequential. Now, similarly, when we talk about
just one thing that I learned from this is, you mentioned that Islam is not just an abstract belief that some people might think, or it's just a religion. It's an entire worldview, an entire system of beliefs, an entire system of how we see the world.
Mm-hmm.
If I actually this Islam is an entire worldview. Now, if I go back to like looking at someone who's a non-Muslim, for example, and him bringing up growing in an environment where there isn't Islam, what he might see the world very differently than a person who is a Muslim.
Mm-hmm.
Comparatively, like how we believe that there is a world of ghaib, the unseen world, and then
Mm-hmm.
we believe in the prophets, we believe in the existence of God. So I think in today's time, generally speaking, how people grow up and what is prevalent in their environment and what they pick up from society is very different from what generally we learn, what Islam dictates to us.
Mm-hmm.
Do you agree with that completely? Or do you have anything to say about that in terms of when we look at this modern world? There's something very similar across many cultures. You'd find that people have a prevalent belief is going on amongst people, which is, as you mentioned, materialism. They look at the world materialistically. That there are many things that they are maybe skeptical about or they completely negate.
Mm-hmm.
So is there a conflict between this general this general worldview that we see what people pick up from society and the Islamic worldview?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so let me just go back and say, because when you said in the beginning of your comments here, like Islam is a complete worldview, traditionally speaking, before the modern period began, go back just like 300 years and before that, in most major cultures in the world, probably all of them, religion performed that function, whether it was for Muslims, even like Christians, Jews, any other group. Like your religion was your worldview. It was that you didn't really need to say it. So if you were not Muslim, you were Christian, you were Jewish, you were Hindu, you were Buddhist, you were whatever. But the idea that you didn't have a religion and that it was not something that was kind of expected to be a very strong determinant of who you were and how you lived in the world, that was very foreign to people. There was no kind of secular option, so to speak. Do you know what I'm saying? There was no such thing as a secular worldview. That wasn't available. in Europe, in the West, in the 17th and 18th centuries and beyond, a fundamental process began to occur, or continued from earlier trends, which ended up secularizing the worldview and moving away from Christianity. If you go back to Shakespeare, for example, who was writing in the early 17th century, so he's born in the maybe 80s, I don't remember his dates, but late 1500s, and he dies like early, mid 1600s, right? If you go back to some of his plays, all of the plays and all of the characters in his play are Christian, right? They don't wear it on their sleeve, but when they talk, they say, there is a king above us all who judges every king. And when we die, we will stand before our maker for judgment. Like, this is all within his plays. And if you spoke that way today, they'd say, oh, that's like a Christian play. Like it's a niche, like for some religious, but back then that was just taken for granted by everybody. There was nobody who didn't believe that, right? And Shakespeare was just writing for a general British audience or, English speaking audience. He was not writing to quote unquote Christians, but that was everybody's worldview. Everybody believed when you die, you're going to be resurrected. You're going to be judged. There is a God that stands above us all. He's the one who sets the rules. Like, this was just common belief, right? Now, when you move into the modern period, for many, different reasons, this starts to get unseated. And after the scientific revolution and then into the 18th century, you have the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment project, it tries to base all of human knowledge on basically two sources, human reason and basically empirical science. And it puts revelation to the side. And it says we're no longer really taking that seriously. Also, they started looking at the Bible more critically, and they found out the Bible just has many issues about just its textual integrity and its authenticity and so forth. So for many different reasons, the Bible kind of like it dropped in people's eyes in the West, and it fell out as a reliable source of knowledge. And the idea was to put all of knowledge, including ethical knowledge and moral knowledge, on reason and empirical science. That's the entire modern project. And this worldview, it gets first like formulated and hammered out by, philosophers in the 18th century. That's why they call the 18th century the Age of Enlightenment. And then in the 19th century, this worldview, it kind of trickles down to the everyday person. In the beginning of the 19th century, it's still, you cannot get hired in a European university if you're known to be an atheist. It would be like unthinkable. How could we hire an atheist to teach people? And how could you trust, it was just totally unacceptable. It's like unimaginable to people that you could be an atheist. It was very, very taboo. This is just 200 years ago. By the end of the 19th century, you have Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher, declaring, quote unquote, God is dead, astaghfirullah, right? So there's a huge change that occurs over the 19th century. Of course, you have Darwin, Darwinism right in the middle, which also contributes culturally to this kind of feeling of the retreat of the divine, if you want. And so then, of course, the 19th century is the age of colonization, right? I mean, of course, in India, it starts already in the 18th century with the British East India Company, but really it's the 18th and into 19th century, particularly, that almost the entire globe, both the Muslim world and other, parts of the world, come under direct European control and hegemony. And then at that time, these ideas and systems and ways of doing things get exported, through like colonial mechanisms. Right. And so this worldview, and also the aspect of liberalism as a philosophy, right? Liberalism as kind of a moral philosophy, as a political philosophy, also gains. There's some noise here because I'm on a main road, so I apologize for that.
No problem.
Liberalism also becomes the main kind of ideological driving force, and that also gets exported. Liberalism basically comes down to this idea that, it looks at the whole modern worldview, it looks at people very individualistically. The individual is kind of the center of attention, not the family, not the tribe, not the religious group. It's the individual, right? So maximizing the freedom of the individual and maximizing individual possibilities and all of this. This is very deeply ingrained in the modern consciousness. And this also gets exported kind of, throughout the world through modern education systems and all of this. First being run directly by like the colonial powers, Britain, especially in your part of the world, France and other parts of the world like North Africa and so forth. And then even when these powers leave, right? India becomes independent of British rule. North Africa becomes, independent of French rule. Nevertheless, they leave governmental systems in place, state systems in place, educational systems in place, that although now they're run by the former colonized peoples, it's the same model. Do you see what I'm saying? And in many cases, it's the same worldview and the same assumptions that continue to live on and get propagated by even people in the post-colonial period, right? Because they've become so dominant in the modern world that people just think, oh, well, this is just what it means to be modern, right? And modern means to be living in the 21st century. Even the 21st century, this is like, European, for us in the Muslims, 15th century, right? 1445 right now, we're coming on to 1440.
Right.
So, even our, look at that. I mean, I work in Islamic studies, and when you look at most books, like some of these books back here, if you read books in the field of Islamic studies, whenever you give a Islamic figure like Imam al-Ghazali, for example, right, you give the death date, it's Hijri and, Miladi, the Gregorian. So they'll say Ghazali died, 505/1111, right? 505 is the Hijri date, 1111 is the Christian date or the Common Era. Most books, once you get to the 19th century, they don't even give the Hijri date anymore. It's like once you get to the 19th century, there is no Hijri date. It's only the Christian date. It's only the Western dating system. That's all that matters. In the modern period, no other paradigm is allowed to exist. So they'll talk about, Anwar Shah Kashmiri or something like that, and they'll say died 1900 whatever. And it's like, well, where's the Hijri date? 13 whatever, and it's gone. Most people don't use it because it's like the modern period is dominated by just one single paradigm, and it declares itself as a universal paradigm, and basically it doesn't really tolerate that any other paradigm should exist.
Okay.
And today, ask many Muslims what is the Hijri date. Ask them what the date is today, and they'll give you it's June 14th, 2024. Okay? Say, no, what's the Hijri date? They probably won't know. Many Muslims won't know what year it is, let alone what month it is, let alone what day it is. But it's impossible to ask someone the date and they say, I don't know, is this 2022? No, 2025? No, it's 2024. Like, of course, everybody would know that, right? But that's just to give you an idea of how, if you go back in the past, I mean, Muslims, we had our own dating system. Now, I'm not saying we should be divorced from the rest of the world. Obviously, things have changed and we have to be pragmatic and we have to keep up. But it's just the extent to which the rest of the world has been swept up into kind of the European project of European modernity, which has been exported as something that is universal, something that applies to everybody in all times and places. Its assumptions are universal. Its ways of knowing are universal. Its ways of viewing the world are universal. Its ethical system is universal, or so they claim, right? And you are, it's not a debate. It's not like, let's talk about this. These are the principles. These are the rules. And this is sort of, you can either accept it and be a dignified member of modern society, or you can be a backward, rogue state or individual. But it's not really a question of discussing different paradigms or allowing for fundamental differences, among different civilizations, right? It's this idea that this is now the universal model that is uncontested and that everybody is expected to live up to. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does make a lot of sense. And then if we look at this, like what you just told me, this is something that should probably be direct in conflict with the Islamic worldview, because they have these kind of assumptions which don't in line with Islam at all. So if we try to compare, like just for our audience, I mean, what assumptions do this worldview have, which like generally not all of them, because if we try to speak about all of them, it's going to be a long lecture.
Yeah.
But generally, if we can pin down some examples of how this is very different from the Islamic worldview, like for example, they believe in Darwinism, they believe in liberalism, they believe in utilitarianism. So they have their own moral system, which is different from Islam. They have their own anthropological view of the human being, which is different from what we Muslims believe. They have their epistemology, which is different from what Muslims believe, and even their ontology, basically what exists, is very different from the Islamic worldview. So I think you already mentioned some of them. So is there something like, which you did not mention, which like, we can actually reflect on now? which is different from the Islamic worldview, or is in direct conflict with the Islamic worldview?
So I think, you basically summed up most of them. I want to say, like, obviously, we shouldn't just say it's not like every aspect of the worldview is completely opposite, right? Because human beings are human beings, and there are things that are shared, there are things that are, so we should also not forget that. But some of the very basic and most important, like, starting assumptions are in fact very different. So, so sometimes where there's an overlap, it's kind of accidental. It's like this system and that system simply produce sometimes, like, at least superficially similar, results or something. But that should not also mask, like, the very deep differences. So I think, you basically,
so like in a graph sense, you'll have some things which, like, intersect between both of them, but overall they both are different worldviews, right?
Exactly, yeah. And they have different starting assumptions and different usul, different roots. And therefore, like, if you have two different trees, like an apple tree and an orange tree, they're going to have different root systems and a different seed and different, basically DNA. And they're going to grow differently. They're going to have a different shape, and they're going to bear different fruit, right? So they're going to have some commonalities, both have stems and leaves and all of that stuff, but like, they're going to bear different fruit. So I think the worldview is very much like that, like, the roots are very different. The basic starting assumptions are very, very different. And sometimes they're actually, often they're diametrically opposed, because modernity, in a sense, is very consciously secular. Like, the modern world prides itself on its secularity. That's one of its main claims to fame in its own eyes. And in many respects, modernity is a reaction against, medieval Christianity, right? So modernity is like a rejection of, in many respects, it's a rejection of the religious paradigm specifically. It's not just accidentally anti-religious, it's like essentially anti-religious. I mean, it means to be anti-religious. It's an growing out of religion, right? Moving beyond it. Now, there are some aspects of modernity that are Christian, right? Or that are impacted by Christianity, either because modernity rejects a particular aspect of Christianity, so it takes on a certain thing which is like the opposite, but maybe as Muslims we never had that particular Christian thing to begin with, so we don't need to adopt the reaction to it because we never had the thing in the first place. But sometimes there are aspects of Christianity that live on into modernity because they're so widely shared in the culture, European culture, which is the basis of, the modern worldview. That's where it grew up first. So there are certain aspects of modernity that are just also, like, taken from Christianity, but incorporated into the modern worldview. But in any case, like, just to take the things that you said, what exists and how do we know, like, when you have revelation or not, like, in terms of your epistemology, what you think are the sources of knowledge available to human beings, that makes a huge difference. Because again, there are many things that we as Muslims would affirm the existence of and the truth of and the reality of. And if you ask us on what basis are you affirming that, we will say we are affirming it on the basis of divine revelation.
Yeah.
Right? So if we take, for example, the question of knowledge and epistemology, as Muslims, obviously, the Quran is something that is front and center. So there are many, many things that we affirm knowledge of that is based, that, if you ask us, what is your basis for affirming this knowledge? We will say our basis is divine revelation, the Quran and also the prophetic Sunnah. So what are things that we can know about if revelation really is an authentic source of knowledge that you could not know otherwise? Well, again, we said before, we have very particular knowledge about the nature of the world, about the nature of God who created the world, our relationship to him, the relationship of everything that exists to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah says, وَإِن مِّن شَيْءٍ إِلَّا يُسَبِّحُ بِحَمْدِهِ. There's nothing that exists except that it sings the praises of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, except we don't understand or, like, perceive their tasbih, right? This is a very different way of looking even at the quote-unquote material world that the secular person and, say, the Muslim both agree exists, right? When the secular person looks at that, they just see matter in motion, like just dead matter, like, or, obviously living things as well, but it's just kind of matter. It doesn't have anything beyond that. When a Muslim who knows about Islam and is infused with the Quranic vision of the world looks out at the world, we realize that the birds, when they're chirping, they're communicating with each other and that, but they're also making tasbih, right? They're actually glorifying their creator. That's a very different way of looking. The tree outside my window is making tasbih, like literally. I don't know how. I don't know. Allah says, وَلَكِنْ لَا تَفْقَهُونَ تَسْبِيحَهُم. You, mankind, you don't understand, you don't perceive, you don't, they're tasbih, but they are making tasbih, right? So just things like that, like seeing the world as like a divine epiphany or something, like the signs and manifestation of Allah's names and attributes. Again, if you say like our affirmation of the existence of things like angels and jinn and things like, the life in the grave after death and everything we know about the Day of Judgment, which is critical to how we live our lives. We're supposed to live our lives with the Day of Judgment in mind, that we will one day die, we will be called to account for our deeds. There is heaven and hell. The Quran is very, very specific about what those places look like and what the experiences are of the people who live in them, right? If you take revelation out of the picture, none of this is knowable because we can't derive it through reason. I can't say, well, there's a logical proof that there must be a heaven and a hell, right? I mean, pure reason can't give you all that much. Like it can help you avoid contradictions and think correctly, but in terms of affirming what exists, there isn't that much to tell you. And then also, if you say, well, we have reason, and the only other source of knowledge we have besides reason is empirical science, well, obviously science, these things are, by virtue of the fact that they're in the ghaib, they're in the unseen realm, they are not accessible to scientific observation.
Right.
I mean, science as a tool is built to look at the seen realm, to investigate the realm of the shahada only. So if there is an unseen realm, then by definition, that realm is not amenable to scientific, inquiry. And if you think that scientific inquiry is the only way to reliably know something, then of course you're going to say, well, all of this stuff is nonsense. Like, how could you possibly know that there's an afterlife? How could you know there's a heaven and a hell? No, I'm
right.
How could you know that human beings have a ruh?
Like looking from their lenses, they can't see it.
All of this is just, this is just speculation, right? It's just speculation because there's only two sources of knowledge, reason and science, and those two sources of knowledge don't provide knowledge of any of this stuff. And in fact, you see in the modern world, as they kind of move beyond revelation, their own revelation, right? Bible and then Christianity as a religion, as they move beyond that as a worldview, right? All of these aspects of it, which they also believe in traditionally, right? Christians believe in a heaven and a hell and an afterlife and a resurrection. And I mean, they're very similar to Muslims in that sense. As the modern world moves beyond that, all of these things start to come to be seen as, like incredible and, folkloric or, superstitious, or just something that, okay, ignorant people in the past believed because they didn't have science and they just believed all these kind of silly things, right? And we modern sophisticated people, we know that this is all, like they say by the 19th century, most Europeans don't believe in hell anymore. Like they just refuse. And then heaven, obviously, they don't believe in, many people just don't believe in any type of afterlife, right? Because there's no source of knowledge for such things.
So it seems like, their epistemology is very myopic in nature. And
it's very limited. It's very limited.
Yeah.
I mean, the modern worldview is, in fact, very limited. People think the opposite. They think, a traditional, quote unquote, traditional worldview, that's like provincial and myopic and limited, and modernity expands. It's not true, actually. Modernity expands the quantity. So when it comes to empirical science, we have learned a lot in the last couple hundred years that we didn't know before, like, billions of galaxies and distances that we could have never imagined in the universe, like, the soul, like the outer space and things like that. But all of that is on the realm of physical existence, the realm of the shahada. Okay. But all other realms of reality are denied. So reality used to be multi-layered. Okay. And the shahada realm was just one of them. And what modernity does is it crushes all of that. It gets rid of everything down to the empirical only. And then that empirical becomes extremely expanded, like very widely expanded. But people don't realize that, yes, that one realm is greatly expanded, but all the other realms have been eliminated. So in fact, it is a very unidimensional way of looking at the world. Because look, as Muslims, we don't deny any of that. We don't deny the empirical. Right? As a Muslim, I don't deny that there are, billions of stars and galaxies and all of this distance. I mean, I have no reason to I accept that, but that doesn't exhaust my worldview. I understand all of that as being the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who is greater than all things, and for whom all of creation, he brought it into existence through his will. He maintains it at every moment through its will. Every single atom in the solar system, and not only so, the entire universe is under the divine command, right? I don't need to deny that in order to accept the reality of these vast distances and all of these things that science has uncovered, right? But that's what I'm saying. It's the way you look at it. When a Muslim scientist, even today, whether in the Muslim world or in the West, like someone who's properly grounded, they go to their labs. Many of them study science, many of them study engineering, medicine, right? They go to their labs and they look in their microscope and they discover something new. The Muslim says what? Subhanallah, right? Because whatever you discover, it's a creation of Allah, right? Any amazing thing you discover, whether it's through the microscope at the microscopic level or through the telescope, so to speak, and instruments which allow us to see very far into outer space, whatever like your paradigm is whatever exists. This is hadha khalqullah, that this is the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And so every scientific discovery increases your faith. It increases your ta'ajjub, increases your sense of wonderment at the creation of Allah, right? Which is how the early modern scientists were. Newton was a very religious man. Kepler was very mystical. Even Descartes was a religious Catholic. I mean, these people, they looked out and they saw what they were doing as discovering, the beauty of God's creation. We could very much sort of, their way of speaking would very much resonate with a Muslim. But, the modern world very quickly kind of moved beyond. They kind of said, well, that was just a remnant of the religious past, and all we really care about is the science itself. And they sort of left that behind. But what I'm saying is that for many people in the West, the more they discover the world, the less religious they've become, because they see it as competing with God. They see okay, we only bring God in as an explanation when we don't have any other explanation. But if I can give you a scientific proof or reason, then I don't need to refer to the divine anymore. This is nonsense. This is a conceptual, mistake that's made. And it's what they call the God of the gaps. I only bring in God as an explanation when there's a gap in my scientific knowledge. And as science progresses and you close the gaps, then, God gets crowded out, so to speak. And then people say, well, we don't need that explanation anymore because we have a sufficient explanation. This is just based on completely wrong philosophical starting assumptions, right? But it tends to have that effect.
And then I think if we look at the development of the modern scientific method itself, you would find that itself started reducing, and then you had laws like methodological naturalism coming in, which made it even more specific and reduced it to only this can be science, and anything outside this is not considered scientific or something along those lines. That is also something we see, right?
Yeah, I mean, so science as a methodology, it at the minimum, it adheres to what they call methodological naturalism, which means that science, qua science, it is trying to look at patterns in the physical universe, right? It's trying to uncover regular patterns. Now, as Muslims, also, we don't deny that there are regular patterns, but what is the metaphysical nature of those patterns? If you ask most people, including the ancient Greeks and also most modern people, particularly in the West, they will say, well, those are natural laws, and they don't go beyond that. A law is something that's ironclad, it's fixed, it can't change, it can't be broken, and those laws are just there. They just happen to be there, okay? And it is in the nature of fire to burn. Fire just has a nature, and when fire comes into contact with cotton or human skin or wood, it burns it. That's the nature of the fire and the nature of the wood or the cotton. As Muslims, we would say that's not actually in the nature of those things. This is actually a divine pattern. This is called an aada ilahiyya, or this is a sunnah of Allah in his universe. Allah runs the universe in predictable ways. He chooses to, associate certain what we call causes with certain effects in our language. But in reality, Allah is the one who creates the cause and Allah creates the effect, and he, simply coordinates them with each other, right? So this doesn't mean that we deny the regularities. And in fact, we are meant to discover those, and we are meant to understand those and, use those also to our benefit, which is what science is trying to understand those. But from a metaphysical perspective, we understand that is actually everything that is happening in the universe. La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. There's the all power ultimately goes back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He is the one who's in charge. He runs everything in the universe. And these regular patterns are, his will. They are contingent upon his will, which also means that if he decides to break those patterns, he's perfectly free to do so. So when Ibrahim alayhi salam, when his people throw him into the fire, right, what does Allah say? Kuni bardan wa salaman ala Ibrahim. Ya nar, O fire, be cool and peaceful for Ibrahim. So Allah commands the fire not to burn. And he can do that because the fire only burns by Allah's will anyway. Right? It's not something that is like inherent to the nature of the fire, that it must burn every single time by necessity. That's not our view of the world. That's not our worldview. So so when Allah says, be cool for Ibrahim, yes, there was fire and it didn't burn human skin in that instance because Allah commanded it not to. That's a miracle. It's a break in the natural pattern, but it's perfectly possible because Allah has power over all things. And even the patterns we see are Allah's patterns. They're not despite Allah. He doesn't, quote unquote, intervene to break the pattern. The pattern is his command, and the break of the pattern is also his command. And, many modern people, even who go to church and they believe in God and they're quite religious. I had someone tell me one time, she was a Christian, went to church every Sunday, and she told me, I don't believe in the virgin birth, like that, Jesus was born of a virgin. She's like, I work in a hospital, I'm a nurse, I see every day how babies are born. And I know how it works. She's like, I don't believe in the virgin birth. And I was kind of shocked because she's a Christian. And I told her there's not a Muslim on the planet that would not affirm the virgin birth. Right. Because it's in the Quran and it's very clear. And if you deny it, you've left Islam basically, because you're denying something that's explicit in the Quran. But we have no problem with this because, we also understand how babies are usually made. We're not stupid, right? But the idea is that that is Allah's pattern. And if Allah wants to, create a child in a woman's womb who has never been with a man before, he can perfectly do that. That's not hard for him to do. There's no logical contradiction involved, and he can do it. And he did it. It's not common, but he did it in the case of Jesus, peace be upon him. And that was a miracle in the creation of Jesus, because Jesus was a prophet among the prophets of God, and prophets come with miracles to, affirm their status as true prophets and so forth. And so we affirm that, absolutely. And we don't deny science by doing that. In fact, no. I mean, we understand science is trying to uncover the patterns, and we don't deny the patterns. But what we do deny is that those patterns are somehow inherent and necessary and unbreakable. That's not the case.
And I think this can also apply to the creation of Adam alayhi salam, which is science cannot accept that, but we know that that can be a break in the pattern, like a de novo creation of Adam alayhi salam. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala placing him as the Khalifa. But I think what is more interesting, what you tell me, is that I have to deal with people. I generally deal with people, Muslims, who generate doubt about this aspect of Islam or that aspect of Islam. But what you have told me, I think it kind of summarizes everything and gives us a reason or foundation why all these kind of doubts are cropping in. Some Muslim might have doubt related to science, to Islam. Some people have moral doubts related to Islam, saying that this aspect of Islam does not seem moral to me. But generally speaking, I think the issue is actually Muslims growing because Muslims have generally been imposed this standard of modernity, which they don't even know. Some of them have consciously or subconsciously adopted them, and now this is where they look at the lens, and this is where they're trying to see that Islam is not fitting in this idea. So I think this is, so what we can summarize as far as that, whatever we spoke about, is that the big problem with the Muslims is Muslims not realizing that they have been fed with modern assumptions, and they have to unlearn them to see Islam for what it is. They cannot do you agree with that?
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. And I think, again, if someone's gone through a modern education system, even if they're in the Muslim world, right, the modern education system will have fed them with these assumptions, even if it's very subtle. Sometimes it's not subtle, but even if it is, they will have just taken on this notion, because the way science is taught to them, for example, it's taught as being much more than it really is. It's taught as being the ultimate explanation for everything. It's taught as being the kind of sole epistemological source that we can rely on. That's not true. It's not taught as just one way of knowing among others, right? It's taught as the be all and end all. Number two, the way things like quote unquote natural law are talked about very much gives the impression that, okay, these are laws, they can't be broken. Any claim that they were broken, whatever, is just nonsense, right? So all of that is very subtly and not so subtly infused in the education system. And so year after year after year after year, you kind of take on those assumptions, and they come to seem so natural that you don't realize that, again, that is a particular set of philosophical assumptions about the world. It's a particular worldview that, it's all contestable. You can contest, every aspect of that, like philosophically speaking, right? And so Muslims sometimes don't realize that they've taken on questionable assumptions, and they just take those for granted because that's the way they're presented to them. And so they have these confusions. Well, wait a minute, how can Jesus be born of a virgin? Like, I've taken biology, right? And that conflicts. Well, yeah, of course you've taken biology. No one says that, I admit that's a break in the pattern. Like, no one's saying that it's normal for that to happen. But the question is, your assumption that it cannot happen, that is a philosophical assumption. It's not a scientific statement. When you say the pattern cannot be broken, that's not a scientific statement. That's a philosophical judgment about the nature of what we're calling scientific laws. We wouldn't call them scientific laws. We would call them something like, again, sunnatullahi fil kawn, like Allah's sunnah in the universe, or, divine patterns, or, we would have other language, ideally, that we would use to describe these things. But sometimes, again, these are very deep-lying assumptions, and people don't know that, okay, they're really acquiring a different paradigm. Their brain is being formatted, like with a different program, so to speak, when they go through this modern education system. And then, all of a sudden they have all these things that they take for granted. Then they see something in the Quran. They're like, wait a minute, these clash. So the Quran must be problematic, or Islam is wrong, or I'm not understanding it right, or, it causes confusion. That's when it comes to, I think, a lot of the modern period. The confusions have revolved around kind of issues of empirical science, because that's been the dominant paradigm in the modern world. But I think more recently, also in the past, but more recently, it's like ethical issues, especially in the West, have come to the fore. With postmodern discourse kind of itself tries to relativize science and the absolutism of modernist discourse. But what it does is it puts the focus on some like ethical issues. So this idea of individualism, of like liberalism, of this notion that we're here to maximize personal freedom and autonomy to the extent possible. This is also something that is very much like infused in the education system, not just the education system, but all of modern culture, in the movies, in the music, in the television series, which are now exported all over the world and consumed by everybody, right? One of the most constant messages is, you are, you do you, be yourself, break free from all chains and shackles, like follow your heart. Like, it's all about you and me and myself, and who am I, and what am I all about, and what should I be doing, and, developing my own, like, self-realization and all of that. Like, again, to a degree, this is fine. Like, of course, we're not just machines. Like, we have personalities. Allah created each of us unique. We have different capabilities, different, things that we can contribute, like, of course. But at the same time, we don't put our own ego on the pedestal, or, we realize that also we exist in cultures and communities and families, and we have duties towards other people. It's not just rights. I'm not here just to maximize my personal freedom. I'm here to actually submit to my creator, right? This idea of like radical freedom. And I don't just mean regular freedom from like political oppression. I mean, this is something that's universal. And of course, as Muslims, we value this as well. But this very radical modern notion of freedom, that I am born to be free of any and all constraints, be they cultural, familial, religious, ethical, whatever. I'm just here to kind of like break out and do my thing. And this rugged individualism, that type of freedom, right? That very radical notion of freedom is something that's very germane to the modern mindset, right? And if you look at Islam, I like to point this out. What does Islam mean? The name of our religion, what is it? What does Islam mean?
Submission.
Yeah,
submission.
Peace is salam. Islam means submission, right? So on the surface of it, that's like diametrically opposed. You have one worldview that's obsessed with freedom, liberation, breaking boundaries, striking out, right? That's very central to the modern worldview. And the other worldview is called submission. Like, that's the name of it. Now, it's not submission to a king. It's not submission to, anything, but it's submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we would say that when you submit to Allah, you free yourself from submission to everything else. You're free from your own ego. You're free from your passions and desires. You're free from, social constraints and all of this, because you are submitted. Ideally, you're submitted to just the one who is free of all constraints and all limits. That's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But nevertheless, the kind of psychological motivation of the Muslim, when we wake up in the morning, like stereotypically the modern person wakes up and says, oh, how can I be as free today as possible, and kind of like, exercise my personal autonomy and my choice and all of this, right? These are the buzzwords. Right. The Muslim doesn't wake up and say, how can I be as free and autonomous as possible? Let me submit to Allah because that's, where I'll get my freedom. Our goal is, how can I be a better servant and slave of Allah today? How can I be more in submission than I was yesterday? How can I be a better abd, which means slave, which is a word that modern people don't like to hear. Now, it's true that in the submission to Allah, there is a very profound freedom that is gained. That is true. But that freedom also is a byproduct. It's not the reason why we submit, right? We submit for its own sake. Our goal is the submission, and the freedom that comes from that is concomitant to it, right? But psychologically, our goal is not the freedom itself. Our goal is to submit to Allah, right? So this is a very different kind of way. Now, it doesn't mean Muslims love to be slaves and we love oppression, we love tyranny. Of course not. And we're supposed to fight against these things and establish justice and so forth. But I'm just saying, if you view the world as all about me and my personal individual freedom and autonomy and self-realization, and you believe that the goal of human beings is to be radically free in that sense, and that the best human society and the best ethical and moral and legal system is the one that allows the maximum amount of like personal freedom and autonomy, that's a very different notion from the one where you say human beings are here to perfect their virtue. They're here to perfect their inner character. They're here to develop religiously. They're here to live lives that will be successful in this life and the next. And this sometimes requires limitations on freedom. It sometimes requires moral judgments to be made. It requires laws to allow certain things and not allow others based on what's actually true and right, not just what individual egos desire, right? These are very different. But if you take on the modern assumption about individualism and about, this very radical notion of personal autonomy and liberal freedom and so forth, if you take that to be true, or if you take that for granted, which again, many, many, many people do in the modern world because it's so pervasive, again, not just in the educational system, but throughout modern culture. If that is your paradigm, then many aspects of Islam are going to look very confusing to you, or they're going to look unjust. Well, why would Allah forbid this? Or why would the Sharia not allow this? That's encroaching upon my personal freedom or someone else's personal freedom, right? And you're going to start looking at things as being unjust, unjustifiable, arbitrary, oppressive, restrictive, right? But all of that is a perception, right? You only see it that way when you perceive it from the assumption that you are here to realize and experience maximum personal freedom and autonomy. But we don't concede that to begin with. Like, that's not our paradigm, right? And because that's not our paradigm, if you start with a different paradigm, then everything in Sharia makes perfect sense, right? If you start with certain assumptions about the human being, the nature of the human being, why we're here, and also you look at, say, the maqasid of the Sharia, right? The scholars looked at the actual ahkam that Allah has promulgated and said, what are the main things that Allah is trying to preserve for human beings? And they came up with a list of 5 or 6 maqasid: the preservation of religion, the preservation of life, the preservation of property, of lineage, of intellect, and of honor, right? And these are things that are universal goods for all human beings, given our true nature, the way Allah has created us. And so it is in our best interest, individually and collectively, in this life and in the next life, both, right, to preserve these particular things. And if that is your paradigm, right, and you see that, okay, human flourishing is not necessarily to be achieved through the maximum amount of personal freedom and individual autonomy, but rather human flourishing, again, collective and individual, this worldly and otherworldly, is best to be gained through the promotion and preservation of these particular sets of values, right? This scale of values. If that's your starting assumption, right, then everything in Islam will make perfect sense, because this ruling that the typical modern liberal will say, oh, that's a restriction on personal freedom and it's unjustified. You'll say, no, but hold on, that rule, right, that you think is restrictive, it's actually vital for promoting this particular end. It's vital for protecting religion. It's vital. Why is zina, prohibited, like premarital or non-marital sex, right? Well, because that directly undermines the sanctity of the family and of lineage and of natural families, parents and children and all of that. And so much of our lives have to do with our families, and so much of our rights and duties and all of that all go through like, who are your relatives? This is very, very central. So yes, of course, sexual freedom is restricted, but it's restricted in the service of protecting a very vital value and a very vital, maqsid or intent that is itself vital for human flourishing, right? So there's a very obvious justification for it. And if you understand the maqasid, if you understand the goals of the Sharia, right, and you understand that those are normative because Allah is the one who knows best what is in our best interest, then it'll make perfect sense to you, and you'll say, well, of course, this is the best system, is the one that upholds these particular values, and the Sharia upholds those values, and so that's the best system. And the fact that it might be in somebody else's eyes abrogating personal freedom here or there, well, so be it. Like the point is, like, their starting assumptions are faulty to begin with.
I think again, in this what you explain, it seems like when they will look at these kind of ethical values in a myopic sense, it might seem that it's not making sense to me, but it's not making sense to them because they are looking at it from a myopic,
exactly, very
sense.
small perspective. Yes,
but if they have a holistic view, and the same we spoke about in terms of science, in terms of ethics, when people are looking at it from a restricted lens is only when it is not making sense to them.
Exactly, yes. When you focus in on one thing and then you make that everything, you're going to have a very distorted view. So
and I think just one thing, I think many of the kind of atheistic arguments or atheistic objections against Islam or religion also can be summarized in this way, like, why is there evil, why this person had to die, because again they're not looking at adding the afterlife in the picture. Again they are myopic. So in every sense, because they have a myopic view, this is the problem.
Right. And that's exactly true. And I think that's a great way to put it, and the other way to say is when you focus on just, if reality is made up of 5 or 6 different things and you only focus on 1 or 2 and you ignore the rest and you make that 1 or 2 everything, well, clearly you're going to have a very distorted view. Right? It's like I say, okay, science, people believe in science in the modern world. So we have physics, we have chemistry, we have biology, for example. What if I just come and say, I'm going to accept physics and chemistry, but I'm just going to ignore biology. Like, I'm just going to ignore it. I'm not going to take anything. Someone say, well, you're going to have a very distorted view. Or I believe in biology and chemistry, but I don't believe in physics. You're like, well, you can't do that. Like, they're all integrated. They're all talking about different aspects of the same reality, like physical reality, or trying to, right? And you have to look at all of them together and kind of piece it all together. And if you just arbitrarily exclude one of them, you're going to have a very distorted view of like the physical world that science is trying to look at. Right? Again, the whole big paradigm itself is, has problematic assumptions even about the physical world. We discussed that before. But
and then one more thing that comes to my mind when you said physics, chemistry, about this example is when you look at the human being itself, like the human being is not just a physical body but a mind and a soul. But if the modern world is not going to agree with the aspect of the soul itself, again they will become myopic, and many things which Islam lays down for us, which is good for the soul, for example zikr and these things, it wouldn't make sense to a modern man. What is he talking about? How can zikr help me with? Because
exactly. Yep. And I think you mentioned before utilitarianism, right? You mentioned that word as the dominant ethical theory of the contemporary age is utilitarianism. This goes back to John Stuart Mill, Jeremy Bentham before him, but mostly Mill's, iteration of it. The idea is that, okay, things are good or bad based on whether they bring about benefit or harm. Now, there's some truth to this, and it is intuitive. But again, that's one aspect of morality. It's not the whole aspect. It's not the entirety of it. Secondly, the bigger question is, and this is where the worldview assumptions come into play, what counts as benefit and harm, right? Well, that depends on your view of what the human being is. If you believe that human beings are primarily or exclusively physical creatures, and who are here to maximize personal autonomy and freedom, then you are going to think that certain things are harmful and not harmful based on those assumptions. But if someone says, well, I'm going to do a harm benefit calculation, but I have very different assumptions about what the human being is, what human interests are, what different aspects exist in us, then I might have a very different calculation of what's harmful or beneficial. Because look, in the modern world, if it's based on mostly like a materialistic view, then the harms and benefits are going to be primarily material, measurable ones. So why is it like in the West, I don't know how it is in India, but in the West over the last 30, 40 years, they've basically declared a war on smoking, okay? When I was growing up in the like late 70s, early 80s, people smoked everywhere, like in restaurants, in like elevators, buses, like smoke was everywhere. And then they started restricting it. Why? Because lung cancer and all of this stuff, they had like empirical evidence, here are the harms, so they started restricting it. Now there's like a non-smoking section in the restaurant. Now the whole restaurant is non-smoking and there's a smoking section. Now you have to smoke outside. Now you have to smoke 50 feet away from the door. All of this stuff. So this is a restriction on freedom, but people accept it because they say this is bringing about the better good, like physical health. That's fine. Like physical health is important, and you know the majority of Muslim scholars say that smoking is haram. So this is fine. We would agree with this, right? But what about other kinds of harm? You know, why was it up until the late 1960s things like pornography were basically banned in the West? And you know, they knew that okay, this is a spiritual harm, it's a moral harm, it's undercutting the moral fiber of society, it's poking its finger at like a very sacred norm, which is that sex should be kept within marriage. You know, pornography is like very obscene in that environment, and so it was legally forbidden. And in the late 60s, in the time of the sexual revolution, they said, no, all of this is nonsense. This is just prudery. This is just like religious, you know, old-fashioned, blah, blah, blah. And all of this stuff needs to be made, you know, permissible and legal, right? And you say, well, wait a minute, but what about the moral harms that are being caused? What about the harm to the soul of seeing these types of things? What about the fact that people will be more inclined maybe to engage in, you know, illicit sexual behavior when it's all around them? And they're more stimulated and there's no more taboo against it or no more sense of like shame or hayat, right? And all of that, well, they didn't care about because they were running on a paradigm which said, well, we live in a material universe. If you can't show me the material harms of it, okay, which you can, there's like venereal disease, there's pregnancy. I mean, I can show you also the, right? But if they'll say, if you can't show us that, don't talk to us about spiritual and moral harms. Those are immaterial things. Those are very contested. Those are very subjective, right? We can't make proper laws in public society that, you know, that cater to those types of things because those aren't real. Why? Because the only thing that's real is like show it to me under a microscope. Show me the figures. Give me the statistics. That's what it means to have a materialistic worldview. And even in the West, that's fairly new because, again, up until the 1960s, even European countries, like pornography was something that was banned. I mean, it existed, but it was undercover. And, you know, you could get, like, the police could confiscate it. And if you were producing it, you could get prosecuted. I mean, it was illegal, essentially, right? Some places maybe were more strict than others, but it was illegal because people understood intuitively that there was some kind of harm. But when you come and say, well, that's all irrelevant now, you make everything permissible because you have a very specific notion of
and then now if we see, like, you know, you would have aspects of pornography actually in movies itself, even like, you know, there's some kind of pornography even on social media, so
right,
which is growing every day. But I think so far what we spoke about, if we try to summarize, we spoke about the modern worldview and the Islamic worldview, and these two are, like, you know, miles apart, completely different from each other.
They have very different starting assumptions, yes.
Very different starting assumptions. And now, for example, if any of our viewers who, like, you know, is coming from, let's say, a modern background, not an Islamic background, and does not understand the Islamic paradigm, what can we say that, you know, why is the Islamic worldview far better than the modern worldview? And, you know, what vices can this modern worldview bring in society, which the Islamic paradigm actually does not? And in fact, Islamic paradigm can offer solutions to the modern paradigm, because I think some people even argue that most of the problems that we face today in the world is coming from the modernist assumptions. Do you agree with that?
I mean, I think most of the problems that we face in terms of our worldview, definitely,
Yeah.
right? I mean, there's a lot of other issues that we're facing, like, economic issues, political issues. Of course, all of these in the end, they are somehow related also to the worldview in terms of which they're functioning. But, I don't want to like put everything all in one basket. Of course, life is like much more complex than that. We need to be nuanced and look at things with the proper having proper regard for various causes.
Let me phrase my question a little in a more nuanced manner. I'm trying to ask you that if there's a society that is actually working from the modernist assumption, what voices can come in this society, and what problems can this say? Let's say there's a hypothetical society, and this hypothetical society starts from the modernist assumptions. What kind of problems can this society potentially face, generally speaking?
Well, it's not hypothetical. We see it, especially in the more modernized parts of the world, right? So we see, for example, in the West, you find extreme individualism, particularly in the United States. You see the complete breakdown of the family. Historically, the norm across the world has been the extended family, which is still true in much of not only the Muslim world, but the so-called third world in general. Entire families live in the same house or building, and people grow up with cousins and aunts and uncles and the whole thing. This used to be the norm. And then in the West, this was whittled down to the nuclear family, mother, father, and children. And now that has completely fallen apart since the 1960s. So people live very much as individuals. People have trouble now getting married and even building families. You have an epidemic of loneliness, which is now there are studies about this. You have an epidemic of older people living alone because they don't have families, or the families don't care about them, or the families are too individualistic to take care of them. Now, sometimes older people need very serious kind of like medical care, but it's not uncommon in the West for people to simply put older parents in a nursing home because, they're busy and they've got their own things, or they live far away, or they couldn't really be bothered to take care of them. Whereas in much of the world, and not just the Muslim world, this would be unthinkable, right? Like your parents, like you have a sacred duty to take care of them to the best of your ability. And so you see those kinds of phenomena. We've seen the entire complete breakdown of gender and gender roles. We've seen the complete breakdown of the family, which we just talked about, right? Which has to do with the breakdown of sexual norms, the widespread acceptance now of zina since the late 1960s and 1970s. Why get married when you can just live, outside of marriage as you would live if you were married, right? The sacredness of the bond and it gets dissolved completely, which is why every act of zina is such a crime, right? Because it's directly undermining one of the most fundamental, if not the most fundamental and important institutions in human society, which is the family, right? That's why every religion and ethical system has usually treated zina like as a very big deal. It's a big thing. It's not just, casual, like, oh, well, who cares? No one's being harmed. We're just having fun. No, this is a big crime and a very serious matter, right? And when you see it spread throughout society, there are many evils that come, not just physical evils like disease, venereal diseases, pregnancy, out of wedlock pregnancy. Now they say, I think in the United States, something like 40% of children are born outside of wedlock, almost half the children, right? This also has effects. Children are born, they need a stable environment. They need to know who their mother is, who their father is, right? They need to be integrated into a proper family, not just born. I mean, having a child is a huge responsibility, right? So to engage in behavior that could result in a child being conceived and born in a situation where there's no father and the mother is not capable of really caring for and all of it, like this is your dhulm to the child. Like you've committed an injustice against the child before it was even born. Do you see what I'm saying? Like there are many ripple effects, and so we see this in contemporary societies. So breakdown of the family, individualism,
and then like for example, let's say what kind of life that child is going to live. Now he's going to be institutionalized in the sense that an institution will take care of him and feed more modernist assumptions in his mind, and that could also bring because the modernist worldview, according to me, what I feel like is The modernist worldview does not give you a real sense of purpose or real sense of meaning in life, and
Right.
that itself can be a problem which can lead to depression, anxiety, even suicidal
Absolutely.
thoughts. Do you
Yeah,
agree?
and absolutely. And if you look at rates of things like depression and anxiety and suicidality, they're highest in the most developed and like modernized countries of the world. Why is that? Do you know what I'm saying? From a materialistic assumption, you would assume that suicidality should be much greater in, say, India than Sweden, because India is in general, like, much poorer and like whatever, more chaotic and all of that, than a place like Sweden, which is very, there's hardly like a poor person. There's this very large social network system and a nanny state and all of this. But in reality, I mean, it could have to do with the weather too. There's like very long winters and all of that. But, you find suicidality very high in places like that, right? Like people are suffering from a deep inner sense of hopelessness and of depression and all of that. And you go to some other societies that they have a lot fewer material goods, but they still have like some sense of, humanity and togetherness and all of this. And although their lives might be very difficult, just physically speaking, compared to some of these more affluent countries, like you find that they actually don't really suffer as much from things like, I'm not saying it doesn't exist in these places, but
Yeah.
in general, like you don't, the level of just kind of clinical depression and suicidality and actual suicide and all of that are much lower in many of these countries that people in the West would think, okay, if anyone should be miserable, it should be people over there, because look, they don't have all of these material goods that we have. And of course, the
And
lesson is, well, maybe there's more to life than just material goods. Like, of course, we enjoy our creature comforts, but that can't be all there is to it, right? And if you think that's all there is to it, you probably end up being very empty on the inside and therefore very depressed, right? And we do see that in in phenomena like in Japan, right, which really jumped onto this kind of modern Western bandwagon, although it's a very different place culturally than, say, Western Europe. You find many of these trends as well, like people not getting married, people not forming relationships, many old people dying, and they're alone in an apartment, and people don't discover their bodies until like weeks and months later. There's like a whole phenomenon of companies who their whole brand is like, we go and clean out apartments that people have discovered like rotting bodies in. Basically, it's like very morbid. Like there are companies who that's what they do. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah. And
because it's a phenomenon, and probably in India, I would imagine, because it's like there's, first of all, so many people, but like everyone's like living all together. Like it's probably pretty unimaginable that someone could die and not be discovered for like 3 weeks, let alone 3 months, because everyone's always living together. And I didn't see the grandmother today where she didn't come to breakfast. Like, it's impossible not to. Like, how could someone die alone and not be discovered for 3-4 weeks? Like that's probably impossible.
And what we face here is, many people here have this trend of, going and studying abroad or doing a job abroad. They have this kind of idea, Lord, this is fascinating to me, I'll go. And many of my friends who went to the West, lived in these Western countries, in Canada, US, when they call me, when I talk to them, or when they come back, they say life over there is very tough. Yeah, they might have good infrastructure, but life is so lonely, it's so depressed. People behave in a very different way. Here, like, when they come back, they always feel like, I'm just waiting to come back here, because over here, we have family systems, we care for each other, and there's this kind of happiness that you can see. In fact, even when I travel to Africa, I would say in Africa, people face a lot of adversity from a materialistic perspective. But I've been in Africa for months, but I see this kind of harmony between societies there, and this kind of happiness that you can see from your own eyes, that which maybe is something that is lacking in a society which has adopted more of the modernist assumptions. Would you agree with that? Have you seen something like that?
I mean, absolutely. I would say, like, also, if you read one book that's very interesting to read, I have it somewhere back here. It's The Road to Mecca by Muhammad Asad. Muhammad Asad was born as a Jew in Austria in the, I guess, late 1800s. His name was Leopold Weiss, and he went to Palestine, particularly in the 1915, like the teens, and he was a reporter for an Austrian newspaper. And then he ended up staying, and he converted to Islam and so forth. But he speaks in that book about, after going to the Muslim world and experiencing a different way of life and a different way of looking at things in a different culture, he went back to Europe and was just so struck by how, and this was 100 years ago, right? Back when Europe was not as far down the path as they are today. People were still going to church back then, and it was still much more traditional than today. But nevertheless, he said, you would sit on a train in Europe, Austria, Germany, wherever, and you would just look at the faces of people across you, and they're just blank. Like there's no life. They're just kind of like shells, right? And he just says, I realized that the people were just like empty on the inside. And this was 100 years ago, you know? And again, like we're much, much further along this development now, quote unquote, development in the West now than 100 years ago. So he was saying this 100 years ago, right? But he could already see that the paradigm, again, it's the paradigm that had been put in place, was already having very palpable effects on people's skepticism. You know, people were skeptical. They were kind of hardened. They were, pessimistic, not enthusiastic about life. They were very much kind of enjoying their creature comforts and all of that. But if you just dig a little bit beneath the surface, you find like just a shell. Like there isn't actual, life and vibrancy and optimism and purpose and, right. And he saw that when he went to places like, the Near East and Arabia and all of that, like people physically and materially had a lot less, right? And you don't always have to have less. Like you could also have material goods, but also, be spiritually grounded as well. I mean, this is possible. And we do have people in our history. Some of the Sahaba were very wealthy, actually. They made a lot of money in the market, but like in the end of the day, they could have lost all of it and it wouldn't have changed their heart, right? Their heart was with Allah. And they said, the dunya, if you have the dunya, it should be in your hand and not in your heart. So if you have the dunya is not bad necessarily, as long as it's in your hand and not in your heart, right? So we're not saying, we're not like, the point is not to, kind of romanticize poverty or something, right? I'm not saying that. But the idea is that, again, everything has to be kept in a proper hierarchy, right? If you have the proper starting assumptions and you're integrating everything into a proper worldview, then you can incorporate a certain amount of wealth and affluence and physical comfort. You can incorporate that into your larger vision without losing your vision, right? Without making that your vision, right? So it really is a matter, I think, of the paradigm with which you are approaching the world, right?
Also, just one thing I would like you to address more is, because you have an entire course on the LGBTQ fitna, and that itself would be stemming from this as a modernist assumption, which would not know what a human being is. So how did now the world came up with like more than 100 genders, more than 75 genders suddenly in a few years span? How did that happen? Can you shed more light on it?
So let me first, so that the audience knows what we're talking about, I'm going to write it here in the chat. I think, does it come in? Does it show to the audience? Sapiens Institute, so people know, because it's all free of charge. You can SAPIENCE, Sapiens Institute. If you just type Sapiens Institute LGBT, this course will come up. And it's in fact 33 hours long. And just so everyone knows, everything we've talked about, worldviews, all of that is in there as well. So 8 hours of the 33 hours, so almost 1/4 of the class, is all about Islam and Western modernity. So if you're interested even just in the worldviews and you're not necessarily interested in the whole LGBT issue, you can still go to that course. And 8 hours of the course is all about what we've been talking about today, in much, much greater detail. And there's a slide deck also that you can download if you go to the website of the course that has over 600 slides, with everything that I've been talking about, like all written out in great detail on the slides. It's all there for you. And it's completely free of charge. You just, sign up for an account on Sapiens Institute and you have access to all of their content. They have many, many, many courses and all of them are free of charge. May Allah bless them and all of those who are supporting their efforts. MashaAllah, it's a great effort to spread knowledge, beneficial knowledge to the ummah with no paywall, which is really wonderful. So, so in that course, I talk about the larger LGBT issue, which at least particularly in the West, but increasingly throughout the world, is really becoming like a very prominent, issue. And the reason I spent 8 hours talking about worldviews and modernity is because I think that LGBT, it's a very salient issue today, and gender, sexuality, like that whole constellation of issues. But there have been other issues that came up before. There will be other issues that come up subsequently. So although it's important to address that particular issue, we also want to look at it as a manifestation of a larger set of, assumptions, right? And in answering it, we want to also build a framework for dealing with modern issues more generally as Muslims. So the idea is that if you take that course, not only will you have inshallah, persuasive and comprehensive, understanding of the whole kind of LGBT and modern gender sexuality discourses, like in general or specifically, but also you will have a more general framework that you can use when a new issue comes up. You kind of know what questions to ask, what kind of assumptions to be looking for. You have a better idea of how to analyze any issue that comes up because you have a framework now. And part of that framework is this worldview kind of framework. So I'm just putting that out there. But specifically, I think that what you see happening in the West is that with the rise of individualism and also this kind of stress on inner feelings, being, the authentic person is basically your inner feelings and so forth, you get this stress on the individual, right? The inner life of the individual becomes key also. And then this gets sexualized by mostly Freud, Sigmund Freud, late 19th and early 20th centuries. He also talks about the sex drive as being absolutely fundamental, not just to us as organisms, but kind of central to our identity and what makes us human. And after his time, over the course of the 20th century, sexuality itself, it starts to take on this kind of meaning as this kind of this autonomous realm of life. Do you know what I'm saying? We don't really have a word in classical Arabic for sexuality. That's kind of a new concept. There are words for sexual intercourse, marriage, different kinds of acts there are words for. But the notion that there's a realm of life called sexuality that has this term that's a separate sphere of consideration, they've come up with they try to translate jinsania or something. They come up with these neologisms, but we don't really have a classical term for that, which means that also the concept didn't really exist as such. But what happens is that sexuality starts to be seen as central to who people are. Do you see what I'm saying? It becomes not just a question of your feelings or your attractions or even your behavior, but it becomes central to who you are as a person. So this is a very important move that takes place. The second thing that happens that I think is also very important is that before the 1960s, right, particularly before the birth control pill, which comes out, I believe, in 1959, before that time, and we lose sight of this, particularly in the West, before that time, there was no real foolproof method of birth control, okay? So every time a man and a woman had relations with each other, there was always the possibility of the natural result of that behavior, which is pregnancy. It is a reproductive act in the end of the day. No matter what other meanings we attach to sexuality personally or culturally or whatever, and there are others, and also as Muslims, yes, it is about love, is it about pleasure, it is about other things too, but in the end of the day, the act is a potentially reproductive act. And when you don't have a foolproof method of birth control, it means that every act of sexual intercourse is potentially going to lead to pregnancy, okay? And because the results, the consequences are so grave, no society can really afford to be sexually liberal in the way that post-1960s Western society claims. Because it doesn't make sense. You cannot simply have women getting pregnant randomly with all of these children and having birth, and there's no way to absorb them, and the fathers are not it would be a social disaster. Okay, so that's what you find across history and across religions and ethical systems. There is almost always this notion that sexuality belongs within marriage. Why? Because the consequences are very grave. Okay, what happens is the birth control pill, it does two things. Conceptually, it separates the sex act from its natural consequence by artificially allowing you to engage in the act, but not have to face the consequences, because it basically, birth control, it prevents conception from occurring. Okay. So conceptually, people say, well, wait a minute, sexuality is, or sexual intercourse is no longer necessarily tied to like pregnancy, okay? And so it allows the meaning of sex to change. People can start assigning it all these different meanings because you've now separated it from its primarily, like traditionally it was primarily a reproductive thing, and now you've taken the reproduction aspect out of it. So now you can repurpose sexuality to be about relationships, about intimacy, about love, about commitment, about personal identity, about freedom. It can become about all these other things because you've taken that one very consequential element out of it. And secondly, because that aspect is now taken out of it, people, particularly in the West, where the religious, commitments were very weakened, by the time you get to the mid to late 20th century, right, with all of the secularization, people say, well, if pregnancy is now something we can control for, then these old moral rules about keeping sexuality within marriage, we don't need to adhere to these anymore, because the reason we adhere to them is because of pregnancy, and now that's taken out of the picture, so we don't have, we can just get rid of the rules. And so I think this was a major catalyst of the sexual revolution in the 1960s. I think without the pill, you would not really have had such a movement, because you could not have afforded to. Just as a society, it would not have made sense to people. You couldn't do that. But when you can at least, in principle, separate the sex act from its natural consequences, all of a sudden it can take on different meanings. And then sex itself no longer comes to be seen as inherently reproductive, and therefore inherently heterosexual, and therefore inherently tied to marriage, right? All of that used to be all together, right? Sexuality, reproduction, marriage, traditional like religious morality, all of those were like tightly bound together. And the sexual revolution comes and basically splits the atom, and each one goes in its separate direction. Reproduction is one thing, I can choose. Sexuality is another thing. It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with reproduction anymore. And because of that, neither one necessarily has to do anything with marriage or morality. All of those become separate. Do you see? So for many modern people, they cannot conceive that, that sexuality is anything other than my personal choice, what I do with my body. I'm sovereign over what I do. There are no moral rules that apply other than just consent or something like that, right? So all of these things that are by nature and by also religion and so forth, tightly bound together, they get artificially separated. At the same time, another process occurs, which is that three things which used to be separate now come to be put together. And those things are desires, actions, and identity. So people in the past, they had desires, including homosexual, like same-sex desires, existed for a long time. And we have this also in our history, our literature. This is, in one sense, a universal phenomenon. It manifests itself in different ways in different societies and places. But only in the modern period, particularly in the 20th century, does sexual desire come to be seen as an identity. Before, desire is something you feel. Whether you act on it or not, that's a different question. It depends on your morals and your values and what you think is right and wrong. You might have a desire and not act on it, right? You might have a desire and act on it, okay? But whether you act on it or not, even if you act on it, it doesn't make it your identity, right? Because look, someone could like commit zina, and that's an action, it's haram, but they don't say, oh, I'm a zani now, like this is my identity and I'm going to go out. Like it's an action you do or you don't do, right? But it's not your identity. But sexuality comes to be conceived of as, I have desires, I must act on them if I have them, otherwise I'm not being authentic to my inner self. And my desires and identity, my desires and my actions that are based on those now go on to form the basis of a personal identity. This is not just what I feel or what I feel and what I do, it is who I am. And this is true especially with respect to like homosexual desires, same-sex desires come to be seen as, I am now a gay person on the inside. And this is a new concept. Even in the late 19th century, early 20th century, if you had asked a person in the West, are you straight or gay, they wouldn't have known what you were talking about. Like they wouldn't have even identified as straight, because the concept didn't exist that you are a particular quote unquote sexuality and that is core to your identity. Like all of this are new concepts. Okay. So everyone, you hear people say today, everyone has a sexuality, you're either gay or straight or bisexual or whatever. Like there's all these, it's like a whole, spectrum now. But the idea that you quote unquote have a sexuality and that that's core to your identity, all of this is part of a paradigm. It's part of a worldview. And this is not universally shared. And if it's more and more widespread today, it's only because Western culture continues to spread as normative through, Western cultural hegemony and the cultural output through movies and music and all of this stuff that the world is becoming more and more subjected to. But that's the only reason. There's nothing inherent about these categories. And so I'll stop now because I've been going on for a long time. But the main problem is that, what we said before is when you separate sex from like pregnancy and marriage and morality, those are all separate. Okay. For many people in the modern West, those have nothing to do with each other anymore. At the same time, desires, actions, and identity are one thing now. Okay. So they took things that are supposed to be separate and they put them all together. And they took things which are supposed to be all together and they separated them. So this is now a disaster because especially when you come and say, like, if you tell someone I'm against zina in the modern West, like they'll think you're kind of old fashioned or backwards or kind of weird, but they won't think that you're a terrible person. But if you say I'm against or my religion does not accept homosexual behavior, all of a sudden you're a bigot, you believe in discrimination, you hate people and all of this stuff. It's a very different reaction you get. And the reason is because, again, homosexuality specifically, it's not just a feeling anymore or a feeling and an action. It's become people's like actual identity. It's their core of who they actually are, not just what they do or what they feel, right? And so from their perspective, you have an arbitrary moral rule. And the reason why I say arbitrary is because in their mind, there's no natural or necessary connection anymore between the sex act and the moral rules that traditionally apply to it, which is that it has to be between a man and a woman because there's a natural teleology or purpose to sexuality, which is reproductive. I mean, all of that used to be taken for granted, okay? And so it was obvious from that paradigm why same-sex behavior was morally problematic, because it violates that natural purpose of the body and the functions of sexuality and all of that. But all of that now is seen to be arbitrary. Okay. So when Muslims say, well, we have a rule that you have to be married to have sex, and marriage is only between a man and a woman, and anything other than that, including homosexual behavior, is haram. For them, that is an arbitrary moral rule. There's no reason for it. There's no justification for it. It's not seen as a natural, like taken for granted thing. They think, well, that's just arbitrary. It's an arbitrary moral rule. Now, your arbitrary moral rule now hits somebody not just in a thing that they want to do and you're saying they shouldn't do it, but it's undermining their very core identity, because now their identity is built on the expression of their sexual desire, particularly same-sex desire. So arbitrary moral rule hits somebody not just in terms of like something they want to do, like, okay, you want to smoke and you can't smoke, you have to go outside. It's this minor inconvenience, but it hits them in their very core identity. That's like that's a big like clash, right?
Right.
And the paradigms completely just go right past each other. And that's why people in the modern West, if you say, I'm against drinking, I'm against zina, I'm against whatever, they say, okay, that's kind of very strict and conservative. But once you say, okay, I'm also against like same-sex behavior or relationships, they experience it as like so totally different, because now you're rejecting an entire person and an entire identity and like who, like, well, as if you say I'm against black people or something, like I'm against black people. You say, well, you can't, like, like, what can they do about it, right? That's, anyway, it's kind of, and they do equate sexuality, sexual orientation with gender and race. They put them all on a par. And of course, in Islam, those are all different. Race is one thing, gender, like male, female, is something different, and sexual behavior these are three completely different things. But anyway, I'll stop.
So also just one question I have is, how did they get to this addition of pronouns also, like they, them, and these kind of pronouns are like, they are also obviously linked to their identity, but why do they have these? Because they don't want to, they want to change the language also, or how language works out?
Yeah, well, that's part of, you could say in a sense, like the postmodern critique of modernism tends to like break down all sorts of categories and distinctions, and it tends to view those as being quote unquote socially constructed. So traditionally, both like in traditional, say, worldviews and also in most of modernity, people considered things like male and female and masculine and feminine and man and woman. Those were considered to be natural categories, right? Like if you're a male, you identify as a man. There's a difference between men and women. Of course, there are some cultural aspects of that. Not every culture, some cultures have like specific ways of like, what they consider acceptable male or female behavior or dress or whatever. But in general, the fact that there is a distinction is universal. And so most people normally have considered this to be something that's naturally occurring. Postmodern critiques tend to look very suspiciously at all such categories and to say they're not natural categories, they're just social constructs. So the fact that we separate men from women, or that we think that just because you have a male body physically, that you should also identify as a male psychologically, all of this is just like a social construct. And we need to break that down. We need to realize that things are much more complex than that. A person can have a male body but identify as a female psychologically, or have a female body and identify as a male psychologically. And if the two don't match up, which should take precedence? Is it the body that's telling the true story and your mind is kind of, out of whack with that, and you should try to bring the mind back into conformity with the body? They used to call it gender identity disorder. The idea is that there was something disordered in the mind, and you should try to like bring the mind back in conformity with the body. But the current paradigm, it puts the mind over the body and says if there's a incongruence, then the real story is really what the person is in the mind. So you are a female if you identify as a female. It doesn't matter whether you have a male or female body, but it's by identifying psychologically, that's what's primary, right? And because that's taken as primary, it becomes very subjective, right? So if you no longer take male and female, like physical male and female, which is like we're a dimorphic species, right? You do have the phenomenon of intersex. There are some people who are born with ambiguous kind of like genitalia, and it's not clear whether they're male or female, but these are very exceptional cases, right? As a rule, we are a dimorphic species. We are male and female. And as long as that's where your starting point, then, you're going to see those as natural categories, and the social and psychological identification of one as being a man and a woman, you're going to see that as being naturally based on gender. But if you take the psychological to be primary, and you can identify as a male, you can identify as a female, you can identify as neither, you can identify as both, right? What you identify psychologically as, that's very subjective. And when you no longer take the biology here to be sort of a determinant of, what used to be considered a natural category, then, anything, like you open the gates to sort of all kind of different variations. Wow. So, I don't want to be either male or female, so I go by they. Like in English, just use the plural so that you avoid gendering me. Well, you say, well, what do you mean? Are you a male or a female? Well, that's irrelevant. My body doesn't matter. It matters like what I subjectively think of myself as in terms of my psychological self-identification, my social role, and all of this. And all of this is much more kind of like ambiguous and personal. And so this is kind of where you get this current trend of a plethora of different genders and gender identities and a whole slew of, different pronouns and things like this, right? Gender is seen as something that's elective, subjective, something that I can sort of project onto my reality, or something that's, that's one way of putting it, or something that's kind of generated within my psyche that may or may not be in conformity with my body. And there's no reason why it necessarily should be. It's its own autonomous thing. Again, things that are normally together, it's like they've been split apart. So your body and the sex of your body is now completely separate, seen as being completely separate from your psychological gender identification or your gender expression, right? How you express yourself in terms of dress and mannerisms and all of that. And we would say, no, these are supposed to line up normatively. They're supposed to line up. And if they don't, then there are obviously anomalous cases and this and that. I mean, we understand that. But as a normative issue, if you have a male body, normatively, you should also identify as a man, right, in society, and you should present as a man, and be attracted to women, right? So on all four levels, and for a female, it's the same but the opposite, right? But in the modern paradigm, you could have a male body and identify as male or female or neither. You could be attracted to either a male or a female or both or whatever. Like that's also just an open question. And then you could express yourself however you want. You might be a male and attracted to women, but you want to wear a skirt and nail polish, and that should be perfectly fine. Of course, for us, that's haram. Like it's haram to actually imitate the opposite sex in your dress and your
one thing I notice is that in this modern time there's one more shift within society, which is the expectation from a man seems to be a little more different, which has changed an expectation from a woman. A woman now with the modern paradigm is expected to behave more like a man, and a man is expected to behave more like a woman.
Exactly.
So this is also that shifts. Now when a woman is when many things are related to feminism, women are expected to how can you be a housewife, how can you do this, you need to work, and these kind of paradigms are also pushed onto the pushed onto the females of the society, and men are men are looked at as toxic. You can't have this view or that view. This is also an aspect of modernity. Would you say that?
Yes. Yeah, of course. And I mean, modernity is like a long, like several hundred-year phenomenon, and these manifestations are all much more recent. But of course, seeds were set much earlier to get to this point. So, I would say that these are some of the fruits of of the modern project, and modern/postmodern project too, because again, postmodern, like in many respects, we're in a postmodern phase, and some of these things, especially this idea that there is no real external reality and that everything is kind of a social construct and all of that, this is not so much modernity as like postmodern. That's the postmodern critique. Right. And I mean, in classical modernity with empirical science in the driver's seat, like people were very much like, no, like you're male or female, and that's the physical body, and I've got proof, and here it is. And that was kind of very much the paradigm. Of course, the psychologization of the self and the coming to the fore of like the inner psycho. This started also, some time ago, and it's been developing, before Freud and through Freud and since then also. But yeah, I mean, this particular manifestation that we see today of this breakdown in the very idea of gender, and also gender norms, obviously, and sexual behavior and relationships, that whole constellation of issues, right? It completely breaks down as of like the 1960s for various reasons. But yes, I mean, definitely this is also a fundamental aspect of it.
So like we saw so many voices that can that build up in a society that is not grounded in reality or does not have the right values. Now, one thing that I want us to discuss about is when you mention this myopic view of the modern worldview, which is just looking at, for example, reasoning, just relying on reasoning and just relying on the empirical sciences. Now, when it comes to the Islamic worldview, which is actually arguing for many other avenues other than these two, we accept these two, but there are many other avenues. How can we critique this this aspect where they say, no, the only reliable source of knowledge is reasoning and empirical sciences? I think because your work also is investigating our theologians, and I believe many Muslim theologians have had good amounts of critique of you viewing reality from this myopic lens. I think Sheikhul Islam Ibn Taymiyyah 700 years ago critique this idea of empiricism, which is kind of very prevalent, which also bring in scientism. So what do you think, how would we as Muslims critique if someone is saying that no, I only believe in reasoning and empirical science? How can we critique that?
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously a much larger discussion, but I think first of all you show the limitations of that view. You also show that view itself is not just to be taken. People in the modern world, they have the luxury of not having to argue for their view because it's taken for granted, right?
Yeah.
But when you say prove to me that nothing exists except what's empirical, like that's not a scientific, that's a philosophical argument. And most people are not really that prepared to defend it because they just take it for granted, and they have the luxury to do so because it's the dominant paradigm. So one is just to critique the assumptions philosophically, right? which we can't do it here, but like, that's what you would have to do, like critique the assumptions philosophically. The other thing is to show the inadequacy of the paradigm. And part of what I say is, like, we as human beings, we're human beings, and there are things about us, like, even among modern people today, like in the secular world, there is a debate about, mind. Like for the modern period, from Descartes on, the modern paradigm has basically, in its majority, has viewed mind as something different from the body. So you have this mind-body dualism, and there's been a lot of talk about how can you reconcile, how do the mind and body interact. But the idea is that most modern people are willing to concede that the mind is something that is not reducible to our physical bodies. It's coordinated with it. And when you have brain damage, then your mind and your cognitive abilities and your self-conscious, that's all affected. So mind and body are certainly coordinated, but most modern people traditionally have been willing to concede that, okay, the mind is something that's substantively different. It is not a material thing. So already there's like a crack in the materialist kind of, view, if you allow for a mind that's not reducible to matter. And this is a debate that's going on not between theologians and scientists, but among scientists and philosophers of scientists and philosophers themselves, regardless of religious commitment, right? So the idea of the whether mind is reducible to matter or not. So, we could say, like, the majority still seems to be, of course, the real hardcore materialists will say, no, of course, mind must be reducible to brain function. But many people don't agree with that, even in the modern world. And I would say that, if you take the mind as something which is not in principle, not reducible to matter, and also something like the soul is not really reducible in principle to the physical body, and then you take things like cognition, language, meaning, the fact that we have self-awareness, all of these things are like big mysteries that even modern science can't really solve. Okay. Also our moral sense, the sense that, we have a sense of right and wrong. Every human being has this, even if they disagree on the details. Like every human being has a sense of, no, that is right and morally wrong. All of these things, it's very difficult to see how a materialistic paradigm can really, adequately account for the existence of these aspects of the human being, or how these aspects can be even in principle reduced to just physicality. Do you see what I'm saying?
Right.
And if you're going to say, well, we're basing everything just on empirical science, like physical nature, right? Then I would say, okay, but in principle, you cannot explain even fundamental aspects of what we know to be true about ourselves, our consciousness, our moral sense, our apprehension of meaning, our language capabilities. All of these things, are not even, I think you can make strong arguments that these are not even in principle capable of being reduced to just the physical. And if that's true, then the modern paradigm that is, banks everything on the physical is self-refuting, because there are certain aspects of reality that we cannot deny. And I'm not talking about God and angels and things like that, but just things about ourselves, which we all know to be true, which in principle cannot be adequately explained by a materialistic paradigm. And if that's true, then the materialistic paradigm itself is false. Do you see? As a paradigm, as an entire worldview.
And then
there's a book 2011 called Mind and Cosmos by an American philosopher called Thomas Nagel, Nagel. And the subtitle of that book, Mind and Cosmos, the subtitle is like, why the neo-Darwinian materialist conception of the world is almost certainly false. I mean, it's a long subtitle.
Right.
He's an atheist and continues to be an atheist, but he says the very reality of the human mind, throws into question the entire modern project, because the mind, by its very nature, by what we know and experience it to be, again, he's an atheist, but the mind that we know and experience, is not even in principle reducible to matter or a material explanation. And therefore, the entire project, which tries to conceive of all of reality in terms of just matter and therefore physical science, is completely inadequate for even in principle being able to explain something like the mind, right? So these are arguments that you can make about the inadequacy of the of the modern paradigm, that it's myopic, it is artificially restricted to just one or two things, and that those one or two things force us not to be able to explain things that we know to be true about ourselves. Quite aside from theological commitment. That's one aspect. The other aspect of it would be to make the positive case for revelation, make the positive case first for the existence of God, which can be done rationally, right? And there are many different arguments that can be, made. And also it's something that human beings naturally intuit anyway, right? It's something that we do have a natural intuition of. So establishing the case for the existence of God, where atheism has become fashionable in many circles. Number two, making the case specifically for revelation and for the Quran specifically, and the truth of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in particular, right? Because it's La ilaha illallah Muhammadun Rasulullah. And some people come to faith not because they thought through like materialism and read Thomas Nagel and all of that, but some people, they literally read the Quran, and it is clear to them that this is not the words of a human being, even if they read it in English. So I've had someone tell me, I read the Quran and it hit me like a ton of bricks. Like it just completely like knocked me out of the ballpark. Like they said, it's like something like I'd never read anything similar to it before. And someone read it, a non-Muslim, and said, it was creepy. Like this book knew more about me than I knew about myself.
Wow.
He's like, book, like it's like speaking like inside me, like it knows more about me. And you're like, yeah, it's because it's from your creator and he does know more about you. But like it's hard to imagine that unless you actually experience it. And so some people, they'll read the Quran. Cat Stevens, who's Yusuf Islam, a British pop star, he was, at the height of his musical career in 1977. He was called Cat Stevens. People might remember him from the older generation. He read the Quran in English, okay, not even Arabic, English. He read it. He had never met a Muslim. And that's it. It was clear to him that this was what it claimed to be. This is the voice of God speaking. This cannot be a human being. And he became Muslim, right? Without even meeting a Muslim. Other people, it's through learning about the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They learn about everything we know about him, his character, this and that. And they say, okay, this can't be a liar. He cannot have been an imposter. He cannot have been schizophrenic or crazy or whatever, right? He must have been who he claimed to be, because no other explanation really makes sense of all the data we have of him, everything we know about him. And the Quran, I always say, it's a very strong claim. It's not, the Quranic, it is the divine voice speaking. It's like from the first person divine perspective. It's not a human perspective saying, oh, human beings, let's come and worship one God. Let's not worship these idols. Let's, be moral people and establish justice. If that were the case, you could say, okay, this Muhammad guy, he was this reformer in the Arabian Peninsula, and he sort of had these like insights, about God and about morality and about human beings. And he was a good man, and he kind of called people to it and whatever. And he thought he was like inspired somehow. And so he called it divine revelation, but clearly it's like, it's his word. Like that's not, the Quran doesn't read that way. It speaks to the Prophet. Yes, alunaka, they ask you. Qul, say to them, right? It even like, abasa wa tawalla, he frowned and turned away. Like it kind of, tells the Prophet, okay, you did something, you should have, not done that, right? So it speaks to him. And I am your Lord, so worship me. Like it's the divine voice. And so if it's not really from God, if the Prophet, peace be upon him, really wrote it, that means like not only is like he's writing it and pretending he's God and pretending like he's the divine voice and making it talk to him. Like this is, this is like, not only are you misguided, but like you're either like this is a terrible thing to do. Like who would like impersonate the divine voice and pretend they're God for 23 years basically, and write something that's like that you're kind of, do you know what I'm saying? Writing
right.
it the divine and making it speak to you, and it's all just like an elaborate ploy so that
many people actually have done stylometric analysis also, and we see that that is completely like cannot be from the Prophet, because the style is completely different.
Style is different from his own, and it's a consistent style. There's one narrative, there's one voice in the Quran, and it's separate from the Prophet's voice that we have through the Hadith. You're right, they have done studies on this, and they're not the same voice. And so these are very clear proofs. This is not just like, well, every religious group just kind of believes in its tradition. And no, like, hatu burhanakum in kuntum sadiqin, bring your proof if indeed you are truthful, right? So we are ready to to, have discussions about this. We don't just believe because our forefathers believed. Like, we are ready to say the Quran is, revelation, and here's why. Here are the reasons. Here are the proofs for that, and here are the responses to the critiques against that. And here is what we would say to other similar claims. And in fact, there are no claims that are actually similar, because the Quran is kind of in a unique position. Even the Christian scriptures, like the New Testament, the Gospels, everybody understands, even the most Orthodox Christian understands that, like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, these are human accounts written by human beings, and not by those four people. We don't actually know the names of the people who wrote them. It's like two people removed. Someone heard it from someone who heard it from Mark. So it's like a sanad that's like, even in hadith science, this would never pass even as like a weak hadith, basically, right? But the point is, like, they know that these are human beings who wrote this, but they say they wrote it under divine inspiration. But it's not. And when Christians read the Bible in church and they finish the reading, they say, this is the word of the Lord. They don't mean it in the same way that we mean it when we say Sadaqallahu al-Azim, when we finish reading the Quran. They mean this is the word of the Lord, like it's inspired by God, but the words were written by human beings. Like it's the words of human beings, but under divine inspiration. That's not what anyone who holds that about the Quran is not a Muslim. Like, you're a kafir. Like, if that's what you believe about the Quran, you're simply not a Muslim, right? I mean, to be a Muslim, like it's like non-negotiable. La ilaha illallah Muhammadun Rasulullah means that the Prophet, peace be upon him, was a messenger of God, and that this book that he brought is literally the divine word, right? It's not his words. It's not his formulation of meanings that he was inspired with by God. These are literally the divine words that he heard in Arabic language and simply transmitted them. Of course, he exemplified them, explained them, showed us what it means to live by them. So he's not just like a tape record. I mean, obviously, like his entire life, as the Aisha said, may Allah be pleased with her, that he was kind of khuluquhu al-Quran, right? His very being was the Quran. It's like a walking Quran in a sense, right? But the words themselves are not, are not his words. Like we say this, like literally God's word, literally, not mediated through a human being, revealed to, but it did not go through. It's not the Prophet's own words that he's using. The hadith is different. Hadith are his words, but the meanings are inspired. So that's right. That's like kind of the Christian notion of revelation, but without a sanad, right? But the Quran and hadith are totally different in that respect. And you don't find the traditional Jewish view of the Torah is like that, but that view is only held now by very, very Orthodox Jews, and most like modern or even conservative Jews kind of understand that the Torah we have today has like a long history, and that they also conceive of it as having been written by human hands from different eras and kind of brought together at different times, and so this also, I think, makes the Quran quite unique. So, and we're not just holding this dogmatically. Like, even modern Western scholars in the modern academy who are not Muslims, the vast majority of them, agree that the Quran that we have today is authentically traceable to, the early 7th century in Arabia, and has come down to us unchanged, right? Now, whether it's the Prophet's words, peace be upon him, or God's words, this is the difference between a Muslim and a non-Muslim. But the idea that the text we have today really is authentically traceable to the time and place that we say it came from, they don't contest this. You have some, voices here and there that try to kind of contest this, but they've never been taken seriously, even by the mainstream of scholarship. Do you know what I'm saying? So it's unique, because you can't say this about the Bible, let alone any text that might be older, like the Hindu scriptures and stuff are even much, much older, and like, would be even, I think, less amenable to kind of like historical substantiation. The Quran is really, I think, quite unique in that sense among religious texts. So these are the types of arguments that Muslims should make to make a positive case for Islam, while also showing the limitations, the inherent limitations of the modern worldview that are being recognized even by people like Thomas Nagel, who themselves are atheists, but they're like, okay, this paradigm simply is false. It's wrong. Like, we need to come up with a new paradigm. He doesn't want that paradigm to include God. It probably has to. I don't think he could come up with one that would be adequate that doesn't. But, no matter where he takes it, or others like him, there is increasingly this notion that, okay, this modern paradigm is, it held sway for a couple hundred years for various reasons, but it's it has too many holes and too many inadequacies to be really, I think, sustainable, as a worldview for much longer.
And one last thing that I think in this topic is, can we, because I've been working in some cognitive science and reading about the Fitrah, can we use the Fitrah itself as an argument against the model worldview? Because when we look at the human being, it's human being, even atheist cognitive scientists like Paul Bloom, they say that the human being is born with the notion that there is material and the immaterial realm. There is the human being and the soul. With this dualism is natural to human beings. And not just that, Paul Bloom and Jesse Bering argue that even the notion of afterlife is something that comes very naturally to human being. So the modern worldview, which tries to reject the afterlife without having any kind of evidence or any kind of good reason to reject it, is something that is questionable. Then comes the whole aspect of teleology, like the human being sees the world with a purpose. Like with the Fitrah, we see that the world is created for a purpose, and then that is something that the modern worldview cannot account for. Then the human being has this natural inclination to believe in God, and not just believe in God, but also the human being needs a kind of moral framework and has some very specific notions about God. So these things are something that is very natural to the human being, and the modern world cannot even account for that, and we cannot even negate that, because if the modern world tries to negate these aspects of the human being, which is integral to us, and still try to rely on the other natural aspect of the human being, which is using our reasoning and our sense experience, all of this is kind of automatically delivered to us by our cognitive system, our very being. So that do you think that itself is questionable? Because your epistemology is flawed in a way. It is inconsistent. It is selectively skeptical. Did you agree with that?
Selectively skeptical, and you are adopting and affirming certain intuitions that we have about the world while blocking others. And everything that you just said, in the field of relatively recent field of the cognitive science of religion, they've established this, that children the world over, naturally and intuitively and innately interpret the world as having been created by some type of creator God, one God too. No matter what religion their society actually follows, they found this to be kind of a natural intuition. And then after that, the society might change the child's belief based on its own, what it believes. It could either educate, quote unquote, that intuition out of you, like that, which happens in a lot of modern societies with modern secular materialistic education systems. That natural intuition kind of gets, not physically beaten out of you, but it gets, quote unquote, educated out of you as you go through the modern, education system. Or it becomes polytheistic or whatever. And this goes along with the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, kullu mawludin yuladu ala al-fitra. Every child is born on the fitrah, which is understood as this natural capacity to come to the knowledge of tawheed, right? As a natural inborn innate capacity to recognize one's creator, that there is a creator, that he's one. And basically, again, this cognitive science of religion has now empirically shown that this intuition doesn't seem to be widely shared, that kullu mawludin yuladu ala al-fitra, it's basically a vindication of that hadith. But then the Prophet goes on to say, فَأَبَوَاهُ يُهَوِّدَانِهِ أَوْ يُنَصِّرَانِهِ أَوْ يُمَجِّسَانِهِ. And then his parents turn him into a Jew or a Christian or a Magian, some other type of religion that's other than kind of the pure Tawheed, which was the religion of Adam alayhi salam, the first man, and the religion of all the prophets, right? That then got distorted by different communities until being restored in its final pure form and final form by the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? So this hadith, makes that very clear. But yes, absolutely, that fitrah aspect is there, and we can actually make good arguments as to how that's not just some random hadith, but it's actually vindicated by what we observe in the world, right? And so the question is, how do we preserve that fitrah, right, and remain on it? And that is what Islam is all about. It is Deen al-Fitrah. Islam is the religion of the primordial nature, which is why it's so widespread, which is why Islam is spread so easily among so many different sectors of humanity, different colors, different cultures, throughout its history, because its theology is straightforward, it's simple, and it's intuitive. And many peoples across the world, when they came to know what Islam is actually saying, they're like, well, of course, yeah, that makes perfect sense. Like, I don't have to go through all these hoops and try to figure out, okay, completely God, completely man, Trinity, like all of these very complex things, right? It's kind of very straightforward, very intuitive, and something that, of course, there's a lot of details and subtleties that theologians have discussed over the centuries for various reasons, but the basic Islamic creed is something that can be understood by a Bedouin in the desert, it can be understood by a philosopher, it can be understood by a modern kind of sophisticated Western person, it can be understood by anyone on any spectrum, of the human, and it's something that's intuitive, right? You hear about it, you learn, of course there's one God. That makes more sense than there being many, right? Of course, that, like, accountability, all of these things are very intuitive to people. And I think that's why also, Muslims should just learn their religion, have confidence in it, and learn to speak about it, with hikmah. Allah says in the Quran, we'll probably have to end here because I do have to go to Japan. So,
Yeah.
that one of the, the most important verses that I always bring up when I talk about this, ud'u ila sabili rabbika bil hikmati wal maw'idati al hasana wajadilhum billati hiya ahsan. Call to the way of your Lord with wisdom and beautiful admonition, and jadilhum, like argue with them or dispute with them or converse with them, like arguments and proofs. Jadilhum, mujadala, billati hiya ahsan, in the best possible way, right? So we should do that. We call with wisdom, we call with admonition, and we also bring forth arguments. All right, and Allah says many times and several times in the Quran, "Hatu burhanakum in kuntum sadiqin." That He's saying, and we should say also to disbelievers and polytheists and others, bring your proof if indeed you are truthful. We are always ready to sit down and talk about proofs, because we don't believe dogmatically, and we don't just believe based on blind faith or taqleed, or we just close our eyes and have this leap of faith. No, right? We believe based on clear signs, clear evidence, clear proofs. Some of those are scientific, some of those are philosophical, some of those are intuitional, some of those are taken from revelation, some of those are taken from human experience. It's a cumulative case that
Right.
we put together that makes it very clear that ja al-haqq wa zahaq al-batil, that the truth has come and the falsehood has vanished. And Allah also says, la ikraha fi din, there is no compulsion in religion, faqad tabayyana ar-rushdu min al-ghayy, because truth has now stood out clearly from error, right? So we don't force anyone. Like, you can't la ikraha fi din, you cannot force someone to become a Muslim. At the same time, we're not relativists. The truth has been made clearly manifest from error, right? And we don't shy away from that. And we try to explain to people and show to them with hikmah, with wisdom, beautiful admonition, and argument in the best possible way, as Allah commands us. We try to show them for their own benefit, not for ours, that this is actually true. This is what resonates with your own inner core, right? With how you've been created. This is what will answer for you all of your most pressing questions that you can spend your entire life looking for answers for and never really find those answers, and never fill that need that you have to find your purpose in life and to find answers to the mystery of existence, right? It's a huge mystery, and the revelation provides the key for understanding that mystery, and knowing what it's all about, and knowing why it was created and what our role is in the midst of it all. So
Subhanallah. I mean, there was a lot, like, we spoke about so many things and we covered so many topics. And just to summarize what you said right now, it is very, strengthening the iman. It tells us that, Islam is the religion that, or the Islamic worldview actually incorporates the intuitive aspect of the human being, the rational aspect of the human being. And not just that, but our, the mind, body, soul. Islam addresses everything of the human being, and Islam is like addressing the human being from a holistic perspective, whereas any other worldview you would find would lack in some or the other way. It might not incorporate the intuitive aspect of the human being or the rational aspect of the human being, might have some rational challenges, or might not incorporate the soul or the mind, etc. And these things are something that we can we have so many avenues to argue for Islam in a nutshell.
right.
Subhanallah, that was brilliant. Subhanallah. So, thank you for giving a lot of time of yours, to have such an esteemed guest like you. Like, we were so delighted to have you on our platform. Now, there is just a small, on a last note, if you can tell us how can Muslims actually can come back to the tradition, because they're moving away from the Islamic tradition, adopting these ideas. Is there any advice that you can give to the youth to be
Yeah,
grounded in their tradition?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, first make yourself aware of the issues, as we've talked about in this, episode. Make yourself aware that you do have a worldview, and that as a Muslim in the modern world, your worldview is a mixture of Islam and things that are very much, opposite to Islam, or coming from a different starting position. All of us are juggling this together, so we need to learn to recognize that. We need to clean our worldview, right? We need to sort of identify the elements that, oh, wait a minute, this is not even part of my worldview to begin with. I've been trained to think this way, but I need to kind of let that go, and I need to recalibrate my thinking, my perception of the world. I need to recalibrate that on Islamic sources. So part of it is to be aware of the issue, right? And then once you are aware of it, try to learn what are the main aspects, the very deep underlying assumptions of the modern worldview that pervade a lot of our thinking and a lot of our action and a lot of our moral judgments, and then try to see what are the implications of those, and how are they affecting our lives and our thinking, and try to just be aware of those, so that you can sort of distance yourself from those once you realize what they are. And that's kind of the negative side of it, like la ilaha illallah, there is no God but Allah. So you negate, then you also affirm. So while you're negating some of those problematic aspects that we've been raised with and kind of fed from a young age and through the culture, you also have to do the positive aspect, which is illallah, except for Allah. And that is learning your deen. Learn your deen from the ulama, from the scholars. Learn your aqidah, right? Your belief system. Learn your fiqh, which is, it encodes Allah's will for us. What is right, what is wrong, how are we supposed to live our lives? Learn your spirituality, your tazkiyat an-nafs, right? What are the virtues that the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, I came only to perfect the noble virtues of character. We have an extremely rich spiritual tradition in Islam. We have an extremely rich ethical tradition in Islam. So, those are the three aspects from the hadith of Jibreel, alayhi salam, when he came to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the companions, and he asked him, what is Islam? And the Prophet mentioned the 5 pillars. What is Iman, belief? And he mentioned belief in God, his angels, books, messengers, the day of judgment, and the divine decree, the good and the bad of it, the qadr. And then what is ihsan? And he said to worship Allah as if you see him, for verily if you do not see him, then verily he sees you. So these are the 3 aspects, the Iman, Islam, and ihsan, right? That's the fiqh, the aqidah, and sort of the tazkiyah, or like tasawwuf aspect, right? In the sense of the purification of the heart and the ethical behavior. So learn that, right? That's the actual meat, so to speak, right? We don't just negate one thing. You need to. The problem with postmodernism, as I mentioned, it negates modernity. It critiques it. It critiques all of these different things, but has nothing to put in its place. It's a deconstructive project, and it doesn't really have a constructive, positive project to put in its place. So it's like acid. You can pour it on something and that thing dissolves, but if you just pour acid on everything, you end up with nothing, which is why it kind of descends into nihilism, right? But for us, we want to negate only to affirm the truth. We negate falsehood to affirm the truth. La ilaha illallah, right? So you negate the negative aspects, but go and learn the positive aspects. Go and learn the deen. Go and learn what the truth actually is about the world, about Allah, your creator, about yourself, your soul, about your destiny, about who you are, about what your role is, why you're here, how you're to behave, right? Learn all of that, and not just by hearsay. Just like you take your studies at the university seriously, or your O levels and A levels and all these other things, you take it seriously. This is the most thing to take the most seriously, because this is life itself and our permanent destiny in the hereafter. Right? So go and learn your deen, and do so with confidence, not arrogance, but confidence, right? As the Prophet ﷺ came into Mecca after having conquered it on a donkey with his head down. He didn't come in proud, but he came in humbly, on a humble animal, in a humble posture, but he came in to establish the truth and to destroy those idols in the Kaaba finally, and to have the black slave Bilal climb to the top of it and declare Allahu Akbar to the entire world from the Kaaba, where the Quraysh had just fallen. And then he also brought the Quraysh in very generously, and he said, these are noble people are used to being noble, we're not going to humiliate them, right? And he brought that's the wisdom, right? So he dealt with that wisdom, and we should learn also the sunnah of the Prophet, peace be upon him, learn his way, learn his character, and do our best to emulate that, which is what Muslims in every age have been called to do, to worship Allah and to follow His messenger. That is the call of the Muslim, the duty of the Muslim in every time and place. And it's no different for us today in the modern age.
Subhanallah. I mean, there's so much that, we spoke about. I think this is going to be phenomenal. I hope that our audiences, take all of those messages, because these are very important lessons that you have provided them. And how much time do you have? I think you don't have time as of now.
Can you just... I have to run, actually.
No problem.
Yeah.
Okay. Jazakallah khairan. I can't even put into words, how happy I am to, see you and, talk to you and learn all these important lessons from you. Jazakallah khairan.
It's very much my honor to be invited onto your platform, and I'm very happy to speak to you and to speak, to your audience as well. May Allah give you success and tawfiq, inshallah, and protect the Muslims everywhere.
Inshallah.
And for our brothers, of course, in Palestine now particularly, and Sudan, other places are undergoing incredible trials. So may Allah bring relief to and victory to all oppressed Muslims across the world, inshallah.
Ameen. And likewise, may Allah bless you immensely for all the work that you're doing, and aid you in all your endeavors. Jazakallah khairan for coming and giving us this opportunity. And we hope that maybe we get another opportunity to see you again, inshallah. So
inshallah, it would be my pleasure.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam.